Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you and welcome to our program, ITAR for Government Contractors, New Developments in 2018. I'm Tom McVeigh with the law firm of Williams Mullen here in Washington, D.C. At the outset, I'd like to thank our friends at National Association of Government Contractors. A number of their members are on the line, are participating today. For those of you who are a member of the group, I know that's a great resource. For those of you who are not members, you might want to think about joining. Also, we have some friends on the line from the Virginia Economic Development Partnership and the Maryland Department of Commerce, Trade and Investment. If your company is in Virginia or Maryland and you're considering expanding business overseas, these groups can be very valuable to you. So if you're interested in more information, just shoot me an email and I'll send you some contact information. All right, what we're going to do today is first I'm going to do a short overview of ITAR and EIR, a little refresher just to get everyone on the same page. Then we'll get into recent developments in these areas of the law. The third part is the question and answer. You will be able to submit questions. I'll answer them, hopefully. This actually usually is the best part of the program. It's the most interesting, so I urge everyone to participate. The way you submit questions is at the bottom of your screen on the left. There's a small icon, and if you click that, it'll say type a question here, so you'll have to type the question in. Once you type it in, I'll see it here on my screen. I'll try to get to questions. I may be able to get to questions during the presentation, depending on what's going on. If not, definitely at the end. And if for some reason we run out of time, I don't get to every one of the questions, of course, just feel free to send me the question in an email. At the end of the program, we'll be sending the PowerPoint slides to everyone as a follow-up. And then again, if you have any questions following the program, my email address will be on that. All right, so DFAR 225.79 and the contract clause 2257048. So many of you are probably seeing this clause in your government contracts. It provides that companies are required to comply with ITAR in their contracts, registration, licensing, technical data, and they're required to flow these requirements down to their subcontractors. Many prime contractors have been inquiring of their subs if the sub is registered and if the sub has an ITAR compliance program. In fact, many primes are requiring the sub to register under ITAR. You may be getting requests like this. The reason is under 2257048, prime contractors are responsible for ITAR compliance in their contracts. And they're concerned that if their subcontractors commit a violation, the prime can have liability. So this is really important for second and third tier suppliers and subcontractors. Your prime is going to be looking at your ITAR compliance. If it's deficient, they'll be nervous. They'll be reluctant to get involved in working with you. If it's strong, if your ITAR compliance is strong, you're the company that they're going to want to work with. So strong ITAR compliance is basically mandatory to be successful in this industry. Also, you should be evaluating your subcontractors for the same reason. You want to make sure that they understand the law, and if they don't, that they could somehow pull you into a problem as well. But by the way, if you don't have this clause in your contracts, you're still required to comply with ITAR. Everyone's required to comply with these requirements of the law. These clauses are just the DOD's way of reminding the contracting community of these requirements. All right, so let's jump right in here. ITAR stands for International Traffic in Arms Regulations. It's administered by the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls at the State Department. The Department of Defense is also heavily involved. DTSA, the Defense Technology Security Administration, and other DOD program offices. And the purpose of these regs is to control defense products and services in the economy. First key concept under ITAR. ITAR contains a list of products. It's called the U.S. Munitions List, and if your product is on the list, you're subject to these controls. This is a key requirement. Everything else flows from that. Now, if you look down the list, you see the items towards the top of the list are clearly military items: tanks, naval vessels, armored vehicles. But if you look down the list a little bit, many of the items start to look a little like commercial items. So chemicals, training, electronics, certain satellites. So sometimes it's a little difficult to determine if the product that you're manufacturing or the service you're providing is on the munitions list. And I'll tell you how to deal with that uncertainty, and we'll be coming to that. All right. Another key point here is ITAR controls not just physical products, but also software and technical data as well. So if your product is on the list, let's say it's a navigational device, software that runs that device is also on the list. And technical data regarding that item is also on the list. Technical data, drawings, algorithms, manuals, any information on the design, manufacture, or use of the item. So if the product is on the list, the electronic files are on the list, the specification sheets, the technical manuals, etc. They're all on the list and subject to these controls. So how does one export technical data, these intangible items? Well, the State Department has a very broad definition of how one exports intangible items, technical data. If you send it abroad, so if you take the training manual and put it in a FedEx envelope and ship it over to Europe, that's the export of technical data. If you go abroad and release it, if you give a presentation at a business meeting overseas or a private conversation with a foreign national in your hotel over in the Middle East or in Asia, that's the export of technical data. Electronic transmissions with foreign persons, sending an email or a fax or a phone call with a foreign national is the export of technical data. And what's most significant, what confuses companies the most, is if the foreign national comes to the U.S. and has access to the information here, that's considered an export as well. It's called a deemed export. And that's even if that foreign national is an employee of your company. There's a case in California called the Suntech microwave case, which was the first criminal indictment and criminal conviction under the deemed export rule. A company in California was doing research on controlled technology. They hired a Chinese national to work in the lab during the summer. They didn't get the export licenses as required, and the company and its senior officers were charged and convicted of the crime. So this is a serious issue. A question that folks frequently ask, very important, is what exactly is a foreign national? If a foreign person is in the U.S. and they have permanent resident alien status, that means they have a green card, then they're treated as if they're a U.S. citizen. If they're here and they only have a visa, a business visa, if they only have a visa, they're treated as a foreign person. Business visa, H-1B visa, intercompany transfer, tourist visa, etc. So it's important to understand that status of the individuals. Another key point here is services. If an item is on the munitions list, performing services for a foreign person related to that item is also on the list and also subject to these controls. Installation services, troubleshooting services, warranty, repair services. If you're performing a service for a foreign party for a USML item, it's called a defense service, and it's on the munitions list. Engineering, retrofitting services, consulting services, etc. Here's some examples of USML items. These are just some random examples. This is not a complete list, of course. Electronic equipment, navigational systems, command control and communication systems, many types of flight control equipment. It's quite extensive. Parts and components are a big part of the story here. If an end item is on the U.S. munitions list, often parts and components that are specially designed to go into that end item are also often on the U.S. munitions list, or in many cases they're on the Commerce Control List and subject to the Export Administration Regulations. I'm going to talk more about the EAR in a little while, but the point is, if there's an end item on the list, if there are parts or components that are specially designed to go into that end item, those parts and components very frequently are also controlled, either on ITAR, under ITAR, or on the Commerce Control List under the EAR. So if you think back to that list that I showed you in the beginning of the U.S. munitions list, that's just the table of contents. So category 6 on that table of contents is naval vessels. Well, naval vessels are on the munitions list, but also many of the subsystems, parts, components, accessories, attachments that are specially designed, the electronics, the communications gear, the nav gear, the computer systems, the software, the high-performance carbon fiber material, et cetera, all controlled. All right, I mentioned services. I mentioned that if you perform a service related to a USML item, that's controlled. That's referred to as a defense service. Defense services also include certain services that aren't necessarily related to a USML item. Certain intelligence and security services are on the munitions list. Military advice, if your company is providing military advice to a foreign party, a foreign ministry of defense, for example, or military training, if military training for foreign forces is a defense service and is regulated. A number of our clients say to us, well, we've been hired by the Army to train foreign military officers. So let's say there's a group of military officers from Taiwan. They're coming to the U.S. for training. The U.S. Army is going to provide the training. And the Army hires your company to actually do the training. And they say, that's not ITAR controlled, is it? The U.S. Army is the one that hired it. And the answer is, if you're training the foreign forces, that's ITAR controlled. That's considered a defense service. Even if you're hired by the U.S. Army, even if you're paid by the Army, even if you're doing the training in the U.S., the beneficiary is still the foreign military. So that's what's important. A key threshold question that the government asks when they're trying to determine if an item is on the munitions list or not is, was the product developed with government research funds, a government-sponsored research program, SBAR programs, and similar types of arrangements. If it is, then there's a pretty good chance it's going to be on the munitions list. But that's one factor among a number of factors that are considered. It's not 100% certain. Some products from DOD research are not ITAR controlled, but often they are. So if you've got any government funding involved, you need to pay particular attention to that. Sometimes your SBIR contract will say if it's ITAR-controlled or not. But if it's silent, if there's nothing in the contract, that does not mean that it's not subject to ITAR. It just means nothing. That means you have to do your own analysis to determine if the item is controlled or not. Some other items covered, Category 17 is classified technical data and services. So if you're involved in classified programs, you need to be involved not just with NISPOM, but all of that activity is also regulated under ITAR. All right, if you're not sure if an item is on the list, sometimes you will look at your product and look at the U.S. Munitions List, and it's not clear. Either it's poorly drafted on the list or the specifications aren't clear. And that's often a problem. But the answer is there's a way to figure that out. The State Department has a process where you can submit a request to them and you describe the product, and they'll tell you if it's on the munitions list or not. It's called a commodity jurisdiction request. And they'll tell you in writing. And so this is very valuable because it's legally binding, and now you have certainty regarding whether your item is controlled or not. But I'll give you a hint when you submit these. We submit these a lot for our clients. Usually we recommend when we submit these, we don't just send in the form and describe the product. We don't just say, here's the product, this is what it does, is it on the list? What we recommend is when we submit these requests, we explain, we advocate why it should not be on the list. We say, we think this item should not be on the list for these reasons. And there's a list of reasons, and there's a list of criteria under the law of what is controlled and what's not. And we cite those criteria. And in addition, we provide evidence to support those criteria. So sales information, for example, and other information that might help. So the people that review these at the State Department and Defense Department, they're very smart and they're very thorough, but it never hurts for you to, if there's something about your product that is favorable to you and it helps get the outcome that you want, make sure that you bring this to their attention when you submit it. We usually, in a CJ, we actually prepare a very detailed letter that goes with it. It's almost like a legal brief. It provides our legal arguments, our evidence, and we make the case. Okay. So up to now we're talking about if we're on this list or not. What happens if your product is on the munitions list? What are the requirements? Well, first, for physical products, you cannot export the item unless you get an export license. Okay? Can't export the license unless you get an export license. For software and technical data, you can't send or take the item out of the U.S., or you can't disclose it to a foreign national in the U.S. unless you get a license. You can't send it or take it out of the U.S. or disclose it to a foreign national in the U.S. Unless you get a license or a license exception applies. Taking it includes taking it out of the U.S. If you're in the cab on the way to the airport, you've got your trusty laptop with you. Well, if in that laptop you have some of this, the technical drawings for that component that you designed for the F-35, and once that airplane takes off and you leave the country, you've just exported technical data. Even if you don't take it out, even if you don't open the laptop up and you don't take the technical data out, just leaving with having it in the laptop constitutes the export of technical data. All right, other requirements for services. If you perform services for a foreign party related to a USML item, that's called a defense service, and you require an export license for that. The license for defense services is called a Technical Assistance Agreement, or a TAA. So if you perform services for a foreign party overseas, or if you perform services for a foreign party in the U.S., you need a TAA. Well, how do you perform a service for a foreign party in the U.S.? A phone call. There's a company over in Europe. They've just hired your company to give them some advice about how to integrate some defense component into a system. You're sitting in your office here in Herndon, Virginia. You're talking to this guy over in the UK. That's a defense service, even if you haven't left the U.S. Also, certain imports are controlled under ITAR. If there are temporary imports of defense items, of USML items, that's regulated under ITAR. Permanent imports of items on the munitions import list are regulated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. All right. Registration is a big area. A lot of companies have questions about this. Companies that manufacture or export items on the munitions list are required to register with the State Department. A lot of companies think that they're only required to register if they export, but that's not correct. If you do no exporting, if you simply manufacture the item, a USML item, in domestic commerce, that's sufficient. That triggers the requirement to register. In fact, the regulation states if a company manufactures or exports or temporarily imports an item on the list or performs a defense service, it's required to register. If a company manufactures or exports or temporarily imports or performs a defense service, required to register. Also, brokering, ITAR brokers are required to register as well. There's a number of other requirements. There's record-keeping requirements, which are quite important. These provide that the company is required to maintain copies of all of its documents related to ITAR activities for a period of 5 years. That period is extended to a longer period in certain instances, so I won't go through the details, but you should be maintaining copies of all your records, including hard copy, electronic records, emails, etc. The companies that pay sales commissions to foreign parties who are selling ITAR-controlled items. So let's say you hire a sales rep in the UAE and they're selling contracts to help you get services over there. You're required to provide a report to the State Department on the sales commissions paid. Debarred parties, U.S. companies are prohibited from entering transactions with other companies that have been debarred by the State Department under ITAR. So U.S. companies usually screen all the parties to their transactions to make sure you're not dealing with a debarred party. So there are more requirements. We don't have time to go into all the details, but of course I'll be glad to discuss any of these other requirements if folks have a question. The takeaway here is if you're doing almost any kind of work involving the DOD, it's probably subject to ITAR if you're supplying hardware, parts or components, performing services, doing technical analyses, writing software, writing reports. All of those things could trigger these ITAR requirements, prime contractors, second or third tier, subs, etc. So you should have this on the radar screen. A lot of clients ask us, are we subject to ITAR if we don't export anything? All right, and that's a big misunderstanding. As I said previously, many of these requirements apply even if you don't export anything. So, for example, registration. Even if you just do domestic manufacturing, you're required to register. Disclosure of ITAR-controlled technical data to foreign persons in the U.S. is controlled. That's regulated under ITAR, even if you don't export anything. Performing defense services for a foreign party while you're in the U.S. is regulated. So these are somewhat broad. A similar question here. Companies say, are we subject to ITAR even if we only perform services for the U.S. government, even if our only customer is the U.S. government? And the answer, once again, is yes. Registration, often if you're exporting a product to be delivered to a U.S. government customer overseas, if you're the exporter of that item, you may be required to obtain an export license. So you're shipping something over to a U.S. naval base in Japan, the item is on the munitions list, you may be required to get that export license. If the U.S. government is shipping the product, that's different. They may be required to get the license. Also, if you're shipping equipment for you to use in your government contract, if you're performing services for the government, let's say in Iraq or Afghanistan, and you're bringing equipment with you, communications equipment, your TA-50 equipment, you may need export licenses for those items. And the list goes on. All right. So what happens if something goes wrong? As we've mentioned, this is a criminal statute, the Arms Export Control Act. Violations have civil and criminal penalties, including fines of up to $1 million per violation and imprisonment of up to 20 years. The Justice Department will prosecute both the corporate defendant as well as officers and directors, shareholders and employees in their personal capacities if they're involved in the violations. Other sanctions that are available include debarment, denial of export privileges, etc. For many companies, debarment is one of the worst things they could face. All right, here's some of the recent cases. The largest enforcement case used to be the BAE Systems ITAR case. It was $479 million combined civil and criminal penalties. That was for both ITAR and FCPA violations. The largest just came down last year, or earlier this year. It's the ZTE case. It's $1.19 billion in penalties. All right, let's see here. Often a part of this enforcement process, if there's a violation, the government may post an announcement on their website about the case. So then this goes up on the internet and it talks about your company. Then anytime anyone Googles your company, this press release comes out. About a third of the prosecutions by the Justice Department for ITAR violations are large companies. 2/3 are mid-size or small companies. Why go after small companies? Why is the government hassling these small mid-sized companies? And there's two reasons. The first is some of the most sophisticated technology in the defense supply chain is being developed right now by small and mid-sized companies. The SBIR contractors, the other companies that are doing this research, these are the defense technologies of the future. So this is some of the most valuable stuff. So they want to protect it even at this level. The other reason is they don't want small companies to think they get a free pass. They don't want them to think that they can ignore the law. They want to maintain the integrity of the defense supply chain. We're going to talk more in a little while about another case, the Bright Lights case, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. All right. If you discover a violation, all right, so let's say you're chugging along, you're doing your work, your company's doing great things, and all of a sudden you realize that there was a violation. Well, there's a checklist that we have for dealing with violations when we're brought in. The first thing you do is stop the ongoing activity. It's one thing if you committed a violation last year. It was an isolated event. It only happened once. It's not going on anymore. Usually if it's something like that, that's sort of a containable problem. If you have good counsel, you can figure out how to manage that. But if the problem is ongoing, let's say your contract has a new shipment every month or new services performed on an ongoing basis, and you're doing it now, you'll be doing it next month, you'll be doing it next month, that's a much more serious problem. That's called an ongoing violation, and that can make things a whole lot worse. So usually what we say is if there's something that gives rise to the violation, stop the ongoing activity so we're only dealing with something in the past rather than something ongoing. The next step is just to assess the situation, collect the facts, analyze it, and try to understand what the violation is. In the enforcement context, there's something very valuable called a voluntary disclosure. Many of you may know about this, but if not, a voluntary disclosure is if you discover a violation, you can go to the State Department and tell them in advance, voluntarily, that you've committed this violation. You tell them, this is what we did, this is what we found, and these are the steps we're taking to correct it. If you submit a voluntary disclosure, it is very common for the U.S. government, when they receive those, to not bring an enforcement case for that matter. Often they issue a letter that says we're closing the file with no enforcement case. I can't guarantee that for every case. Every case is different, but I would say in a very large number of cases, those are the outcome. So these voluntary disclosures are very valuable because if you do have a problem, it is one way to sort of clean up the situation, get rid of the violation, and wipe the slate clean. The key, there's a couple of keys to these. Number one, you need to tell the whole story. You can't tell part of the story, because then if they later discover the problem, it would not be a valid disclosure. The second thing is these don't work if the government already knows about the violation. So if the government has sent you a subpoena, they've requested documents about a particular contract you're working on, unfortunately it's too late to do a voluntary disclosure for the matter subject to the subpoena. But there are a lot of options available. Our recommendation is get counsel involved pretty quickly if you've got a compliance problem. All right, so compliance strategy. So let's say you are regulated. Let's say the company is subject to ITAR. What's your strategy for dealing with this? All right, you all are familiar with these requirements. You took the time to come to the webinar to listen to all of these points. You're now smart. So how do you get everyone else in your company to come up the learning curve and to understand this stuff? So our three-prong recommendation is classification, application, compliance program. Classification simply means you need to classify your products, jurisdiction and classification. You need to see if they're listed on the U.S. Munitions List or on the Commerce Control List. If you remember, I said in the beginning, if you're on the list, you're subject to these controls. Well, if you haven't reviewed whether your products are on the list or not, you don't know what's controlled and what's not. So that really is the starting point. Number two, application. That simply means if you need a license or a TAA, apply for it. You'll probably get it, and then you can do the business. You just need to get the license. A lot of people think that, oh, my product is regulated under ITAR. I'll never be able to do any international business, and that's incorrect. In many cases, you will be able to. In most cases, you just will need to obtain the appropriate export license, TAA, etc. The third piece is compliance program. A compliance program is a management system that you adopt in your company. This is the list of components. It's a system to get everyone in the company to learn about the law, to understand it, and to comply with it. So the first thing we recommend is you put someone in charge of compliance within the company. It's that person's job to get smart on these regs. You adopt written policies and procedures. What do we do? If we need a license, what do we do if we're performing a defense service? If we have a foreign national that we're disclosing these items, our data security, etc. So written policies and procedures. You do training for your employees, those employees who will be dealing in ITAR-controlled items, and you put it all together in a management system. We do this in our law firm for our clients, including preparing the policies and procedures and doing the training. It's one of the most important things that we do for our clients in this area. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So, all right. The last part of this intro here, I just want to mention real briefly the Export Administration Regulations. The EAR, this is a separate set of regulations that apply to commercial products. Remember I said ITAR applies to military products. The Export Administration Regulations apply to commercial products. Why have two separate sets of laws? I'll spare you the boring background of the politics behind it, but just suffice it to say there's two sets of controls for military or commercial. There is a lot of overlap between the two. So the EAR does control certain military items, and in some cases ITAR controls commercial items. They try not to, but sometimes they do. So to do this properly, you really need to have both sets of these regulations on your radar screen. Now, the requirements under the EAR in many cases are very similar to ITAR. The EAR, they also have a list of products. The list is called the Commerce Control List. And if your product is on that list, it may require an export license depending on the country it's going to and other factors. In those instances, you obtain the export license from the Commerce Department. Other similarities, the EAR also regulate technical data, similar to ITAR. Under the EAR, they don't use the term technical data, they use the term technology, but it's the exact same concept. They have the deemed export rule as well, so it's all covered. So you can see that these are really more commercial items than military items. Also, under the EAR, there's a number of requirements that apply to all export transactions, even if the item is not listed on the Commerce Control List. There are certain prohibited countries you're not allowed to sell to. There are certain prohibited parties, companies and people overseas that you're not permitted to sell to, certain prohibited end uses. So you need to be mindful of these as well. We don't have the time to drill down too deeply, but I can answer questions about all these. And the way you're supposed to do this is, if you have an item, a product, you're supposed to see if it's controlled under ITAR first. That's considered the higher level of control. Look to see if the item is on the U.S. Munitions List. If it is, you follow ITAR. If it's not regulated under ITAR, then you look to see if it's on the Commerce Control List, and then you follow the regulations in the Commerce Department. A couple of years ago, 2014, the agencies went through a series of significant amendments to ITAR and EAR called Export Control Reform. In that process, the Department of State and Defense and Commerce, they went through the munitions list. State and Defense went through the munitions list. They removed certain items from the list. They cleaned it up. They redefined many of the items. They made it a more positive technical list. So that's the good news. The items that were removed from the list, however, those were not decontrolled. Rather, they were sent over to the Commerce Department and put on the Commerce Control List. So those items are still regulated. They're just regulated by Commerce. If they're on the military items moved from ITAR to EAR are called 600 series items, the 600 series. For 600 series items, you still require export licenses for most destinations. They're still subject to other restrictions, but commerce, such as the arms embargoes, etc. But the commerce requirements are a little more flexible. They're a little less burdensome than dealing with ITAR. All right. At this point, let's turn to some recent developments. This article ran in the Washington Post last week. The picture was blurry in the newspaper article, but you can see the theme behind the article. The theme is a staggering portion of our defense capability are based on electronic systems or data systems. Just an overwhelming portion of our defense capability is built on the back of these electronic networks. So in terms of new developments, this really is the most important, the increased emphasis on data security. All right. So data security now is becoming vitally important in the defense supply chain. The government is paying particular attention to these issues, both the DOD as well as civil agencies. Under this DFAR 252-204-7012, if contractors are handling what's called covered defense information, they're required to adopt data security controls within their data systems. Covered defense information includes ITAR-controlled and EAR-controlled technical data. So if you're processing those technical drawings of the components, the ITAR-controlled components, or in your data system, or you're processing the operating manuals. Let's say you have a Word file in your computer system with the operating manuals, the spec sheets for the ITAR-controlled item. You're required to adopt security standards for the IT system. And this is even if you're not exporting the items. The controls vary, depend on the types of contracts and the types of services. For companies that actually run government computers, there's a certain set of standards. For companies that process this data on their own computers, those are the ones that typically fall in for this 204-7012. The security standard for that group of people is NIST SP 800-171. Your IT people, I'm sure, are familiar with this. If not, they really need to be. The required implementation date for these security controls is December 31st, 2017. So obviously that's coming up very quickly. Under this, the 7012, there's other requirements for reporting cyber incidents to the DoD, use of cloud resources. If you're going to use, put some of your data in the cloud, there's certain requirements, security requirements for those as well, FedRAMP, etc. And there's a mandatory flow down requirement. Contractors are required to include these clauses in contracts that they enter with their subcontractors. All right, another change. DDTC has plans to transfer commercial firearms from ITAR controls to EAR controls. Right now, firearms are regulated under ITAR. Category 1 and Category 2 are firearms. Category 3 is ammunition. Under the proposed change, state will be transferring commercial firearms from ITAR over to the Commerce Control List and for regulation under the Export Administration regulations. Once regulated by the Commerce Department, you'll still need export licenses and some other requirements will apply. But many people believe that if you're regulated under the EAR, the controls are less burdensome than if it's ITAR control. The ammunition for commercial firearms will most likely also be transferred, as well as parts, components, and accessories and attachments for the firearms. Military firearms, however, will not be transferred. It's expected that military firearms and ammunition will remain controlled by the State Department under ITAR. The status of this change, they've been talking about this for a while. We're told by the Deputy Assistant Secretary Nielsen the regs are drafted. They're in R&D for review. We don't know when they're going to pull the final implementation. These have almost been adopted previously on a number of occasions, and they get right down to the wire and they don't adopt them. This is a very politically sensitive issue because of firearms, and so that's why the people at State and Commerce will tell you that this is above their pay grade. They're not making the decision. It's a White House decision. So stay tuned for more on that. It could be happening in the next couple of weeks. If you're interested in UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, or specialized systems or components used in UAVs, some changes may be coming. Currently, military and armed UAVs are regulated under ITAR. Commercial UAVs are regulated under the EAR. UAVs are regulated, these are very highly regulated, but one of the most sensitive areas in the defense field. They're regulated on what's called the Missile Technology Control Regime, the MTCR. And basically, for the very highest level of UAVs, the U.S. government grants very few export licenses at all. A few years ago, they granted effectively no export licenses, particularly under ITAR. Within the last few years, they've liberalized the policy a little bit. They are granting licenses mostly to U.S. allies. Occasionally there's armed UAVs. More frequently they're unarmed UAVs, so for reconnaissance and intelligence purposes, etc. Right now the administration is undergoing a policy review. There's discussion that they may lower the standard of where they grant the licenses, and in effect they may be granting more export licenses for some of these items. This is not a done deal yet, so don't go out and start making decisions based on this. It's still, the change is still pending. This next change is a very important development for this group, the folks on this call. This is the bright lights enforcement case. This is a State Department case that came down a few months ago, State Department ITAR enforcement case. The State Department, the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, enforces these laws on a civil basis along with the Justice Department on a criminal basis. This is a DDTC enforcement case under ITAR. The facts are important. This company, Bright Lights, is a small defense manufacturer in the northeastern United States. They make what the State Department put in the charging letter. They make, quote, minor spare parts, rubber stoppers, seal assemblies, grommets, etc. So you get the idea. They're small, low-value, almost commodity-type components, but they're specially designed for use in military activity. If they are, then they're controlled under ITAR. Many of the items in this case, the case said in the documents, many of the items had been transferred from ITAR to the EAR under export control reform. The violations that were alleged, number one, sending drawings of these parts. The U.S. company was sending drawings of the ITAR control parts to foreign suppliers to obtain quotes for manufacturing. So you know how companies, if they're sourcing, they like to look overseas to India and China and Mexico for sources of for low-cost sources of supply. In this instance, it was alleged by the State Department that this company was sending the electronic drawings over to India and China to get quotes for these components. And as we mentioned previously, if an item is controlled, the electronic drawings are also controlled. So you're not permitted to export those electronic drawings without a license. And in this case, it was alleged they were not getting that license. Another alleged violation was posting the electronic drawings online in manufacturing sourcing websites. And I think many of you have probably seen those. The State Department pointed out that a website on the internet, people can see that all over the world. So in their view, if you put something on a website on the internet, that's considered exporting the items. The third violation was sending samples of these components overseas to the foreign manufacturers. The fourth allegation is quite interesting, violation of the record-keeping requirements. They didn't maintain their records for the five-year record-keeping period. The DDTC called their practices, quote, significant training and compliance program deficiencies, close quote. So this is what they were concerned about in this enforcement case. The company was fined $400,000. They agreed to a civil penalty of $400,000. This sounds like a lot of money, although it's actually small compared to what could have been the fine could have been, or the penalty. So the takeaway here is the following, and this is what our clients ask us these questions all the time, and this is really the conclusion from this. Number one, does the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls really care about regulating small companies? Well, according to this case, yes, absolutely. Small companies are subject to these enforcement cases like anyone else. Is DDTC interested in protecting small, low-value components? And the answer, once again, is yes. Even if these components appear to be insignificant, in my opinion, I think state and the DOD is interested in maintaining the integrity of the defense supply chain. So they're sending a message that even if for small, insignificant items, they still expect companies to comply with the law. Does DDTC prosecute companies for record-keeping violations? Apparently, in this case, they do. Often when DDTC comes out with this case, the cases like this, they're trying to send a message. So the message is out there, and folks should be mindful of this. There's another set of changes. I didn't do a slide for this, but I put it in at the last minute. I do want to mention it. There's two proposed amendments to the regulations. There's a proposed amendment to the license exception at section 123.4, which is temporary imports. Under this exemption, if you have a temporary import, you will not require an export license in certain instances, such as for servicing and repair servicing and repair of certain items, or for demonstration at trade shows. However, under its current terms, the license exception only applies to U.S. origin products. They do not apply to foreign manufactured products. Under the proposed change, the exemption would apply to foreign products as well. A footnote here about these license exemptions. The exemptions often have very detailed conditions and limitations. And so if you hear about an exemption, it could be valuable. It may give you authorization to do something, but you need to read the conditions very carefully and make sure you fit within the conditions of that particular exemption. One of the conditions that state frequently requires to use an exemption is that the company is registered. Another condition often is that the exemptions cannot be used for significant military equipment, or SME, items that have a little asterisk next to them on the munitions list. You also can't use exemptions for sales to the proscribed countries in 126.1. So you need to use care with exemptions. There's another exemption also supposed to be amended soon. It's the section 126.4 exemption. This is the so-called buy and for exemption. And what it provides is if you're exporting an item to the U.S. government overseas, there's a license exemption that would apply. However, the exemption right now is extremely narrowly drafted. It only applies to temporary exports and not permanent exports. It also only applies if the U.S. government has handled the transportation of the item. It does not apply if the U.S. company is the exporter. So, as I mentioned, under these license exemptions, there are often conditions. In this instance, the conditions are very severe, and it almost renders this thing almost useless, except in very narrow instances. There's a proposal to broaden it, to make it more user-friendly, and this could be very helpful for government contractors. I have a copy of a draft of the proposed new language. If anyone's interested, let me know and I'll shoot you a copy. This has not been finalized, so please do not go out and start acting like this has been adopted. This is only in proposal form, but it looks like it's in the works, and it's possible that this will become finalized. All right, the last new development we want to alert folks about. The DDTC is undertaking a modernization of their computer system. So as you folks probably know, when you're submitting licenses and registrations and TAAs, it's all done through D-Trade, through an electronic computer system. that state uses. And some people like it, some people don't. But the bottom line is they're in the process of changing it. It's a big set of changes. Almost everything's being redone. A new interface, new payment procedures for the registrations, new security. So it's a big deal. And it's going to affect pretty much everything you do. Filing licenses, doing your registration renewals, commodity jurisdiction requests, disclosures, etc. So the status, this has been underway for over 2 years. They've just started using it. It's being phased in depending on the type of submission that you send in. They're currently using this new system. It's called DECCS, D-E-C-C-S. DECCS is currently being used right now for submitting commodity jurisdiction requests. They will begin using it for licenses, TAAs, and other authorizations early to mid-2018. So these changes are upon us. My recommendation is to come up to speed. There's instructions on the DDTC website, and you probably want to come up to speed before you need to use it rather than when you're actually at the moment of filing something. All right, that's the end of the formal presentation. We're going to take some questions now, and so what I would suggest is if folks have questions, as I mentioned, you can submit them in writing. At the lower left-hand corner, there's a little icon, a round circle. Click that. It'll say type question here, and the question will come in. So let's see here. Let's see. How do you find out what the exemptions are as pertains to the last bullet, use of USML items? Actually, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that without referring back to the slide. Let me come back to that, or maybe I can do that in an email. I need to see the slide. Okay, here's a good question. Is program management considered a defense service? Is program management a defense service? The answer is it depends. A defense service is performing, it depends on the program that you're performing. If it's program management for a foreign party, a foreign Ministry of Defense, a foreign government agency, or even a foreign private company, if the programs deal with defense or they deal with items on the munitions list, then they probably are a defense service and require a TAA. If it's a program that has nothing to do with those, if it's running the postal service and stamping letters for a foreign post office, it probably is not a defense service. Also, as I mentioned, the program, if you're providing military advice, providing certain type of intelligence to foreign customers, certain types of security services, especially if they're military in nature, providing military advice or military training, certainly the program management there is definitely controlled. Okay, how about if we make a product and don't sell it overseas or to foreigners, but the military carries it over after they purchased it? We have a clause in our license that the product could be subject to ITAR. So the bottom line is, for any of these, you have to be very careful to break this down into its constituent parts. So if you manufacture a product, as a general rule, if you manufacture a product in the U.S., deliver it to the government in the U.S., and the U.S. government exports it, that probably will not require an export license. depends on the terms of what's going on. So I'm speaking in very general terms here. However, we need to look carefully at what else is going on. For example, when you deliver that to them, are you providing any services overseas that involve any foreign parties? Are you sending any controlled technical data over, sending it directly over? For example, to folks working for the U.S. government overseas, do they call you in the U.S. and they request technical data and then you send them emails? So there could be things that you're doing beyond simply supplying the product, and you want to make sure you look at those things to see if there's anything controlled in that activity. Another question, my company provides defense services to the U.S. Army only in the U.S. Do I understand correctly that continued ITAR registration is required? So if you perform a service, a defense service is when you perform a service for a foreign party. So if your company is performing a service for the U.S. government in the U.S., that's not a defense service. And you don't need a TAA for that. However, you need to go back and look at the other requirements under ITAR. So that may not be a defense service, but one question is, do you need to register? So you have to ask, are you manufacturing any defense articles? Are you exporting any defense articles? Temporarily importing? Doing any defense services for a foreign person? Or brokering? If you're doing any of those, then you're required to register. It's very possible that if you're supplying to the U.S. government in the U.S. or performing services in the U.S., you're still creating ITAR-controlled technical data. All right, you're performing a contract for the U.S. government. All the work's being done in the U.S., but the technical data that you're developing is still probably ITAR controlled. So you need to be mindful of that. You need to be mindful because you want to make sure you don't export any of that technical data or you don't disclose that technical data to any foreign persons in the U.S., including foreign persons in your own company. A lot of companies have foreign employees, and you're not permitted to disclose that to them. A lot of companies have foreign people working on their IT system. Foreign persons who are in the U.S. on an H-1B, they could be brilliant computer technicians, but if they have access to that controlled technical data, that's a violation. So simply performing a service for the U.S. government in the U.S. by itself may not be a defense service, but you need to look at the other activities to see if that triggers any other ITAR requirements. Okay, this is another question. It looks like related to the previous one. To clarify my question, we are not directly shipping or selling overseas, just to Tampa, for example, and they are deciding to export our software on their own. If you're delivering it to the U.S. customer, to the U.S. government in the U.S., then that transaction is not an export. You don't need a license for that. If the U.S. government decides to export it, then they have to worry about the license. Although, but you need to look at the other requirements. So if the U.S. government does export it, if the U.S. facility overseas that's using it turns to you for support, for help desk, for you to send additional code, to send other things, then there possibly could be some ITAR requirements that apply to that. Another question here, is there a statute of limitations to an infraction that happens in the past? there are statutes of limitations under the Arms Export Control Act, and for ITAR and for EAR is 5 years. In some cases, prosecutors, if they see an ITAR violation, they will prosecute for different types of violations, including ITAR, such as money laundering or conspiracy or other types of criminal acts. Those other violations may have different statutes of limitations, but the ITAR and EAR is 5 years. All right. Let's see. Should a designated trade compliance officer carry personal liability insurance or an umbrella policy? Or should there be an employment agreement with the parent company that describes legal coverage? So the person asking the question points out an important point, that someone serving as a compliance officer has legal responsibility, although bear in mind all the employees have responsibility in this area as well. Should they carry an insurance policy? It really depends on the type of insurance. Most insurance policies that I'm aware of don't cover violations of law. They cover certain types of civil liability, such as employment claims or other things, torts. You may want to check with your broker to see if there is a policy that covers that type of liability. So I'm not aware that it would cover, but check with your insurance folks. There might be something like that that would apply. One person, I would like very much to see the draft language of the change to paragraph 126.4. Whoever wrote that, just shoot me an email and then I'll send it to you so I know how to get a hold of you. Will hard copy of the slides at the presentation be available? Yes, we'll be sending those out after the program. All right, a question about services. Knowing that general engineering principles are exempt, how are services related to the engineering and design of facilities, warehouse or bunker, for example, for U.S. government clients treated? What if the same design engineering services are performed for a foreign sovereign entity? The difficulty is that these services are not goods and thus more easily categorized. So this is a very good question. First of all, as we've all learned, these regs apply not just to products but to certain services. If you're for services, if you're only providing services for the U.S. government, usually those are not considered defense services and wouldn't use a TAA. If in a contract, if you're performing services for the U.S. government and you also have to perform services with or for foreign parties, then that does require a TAA. So for example, if you're performing a service for a U.S. government and they also ask you to perform those services for the Iraqi military, or for the Afghanistan Ministry of Defense, or for coalition forces, then that would be a foreign party and that would be a defense service. If it's involved with NATO, if you're performing a service for the DOD but you're also assisting NATO or the UN, those are considered foreign parties and those are defense services. So if it's an example we use a lot with our clients is if you're briefing that you just performed a study, you're briefing a service for the U.S. Admiral overseas in Tokyo, you're briefing him on the results of your study, you're going through your PowerPoint slides, you're telling him what you've just concluded. That's not a defense service, but if he says, listen, I want Admiral so-and-so from the Japanese Navy to hear this, or I want General so-and-so from the Afghan army, let him come into this discussion. I want him to hear what you're telling me. Now, if that foreign person walks in the room and you're briefing those foreign persons, then that becomes a defense service, which requires a TAA. So merely to performing the service for the U.S. government is not a defense service, but you need to be careful to look at other components of what you're doing to see if those things trigger some of these ITAR requirements. Now, in that person's question, the last question, there was a very interesting example. He said warehouse or bunker. So if we're doing engineering services for a warehouse or a bunker, and in that case he said if he's doing it for a foreign party, if you're designing a warehouse, just a plain old vanilla warehouse, 4 walls and a roof for a foreign company, the warehouses are not on the munitions list and they're not subject to ITAR. If you're doing engineering services related to military items, those services may be regulated and probably are, in which case that is a defense service and you would require a TAA, a technical assistance agreement. So if you're designing a bunker, if you're designing specialized military aircraft facilities, special weapons buildings and things like that, the word bunkers jumped right out at me. If you're designing a warehouse, it's probably not controlled. If you're performing engineering on a bunker, it probably is. You probably need a TAA. Okay. All right. This one about slide 19, I just can't figure this. It's not clear what this question is about DS4076. Just send that to me in an email. Okay, another question. Send it and put a little more information in. I'm just having trouble understanding the question. I understand that submitting for a license is a precise process and can be easily turned back for revision. Are commodity jurisdictions just as sensitive? Okay, so what this person is saying is when you submit a license, if you don't get a license application, if you're submitting an application for a license to the State Department, sometimes if you don't fill the boxes in correctly, they'll send it back to you and they'll tell you to start again. It's called RWA. That means return without action. And that can be a pain because if you're trying to get something going and you're on a tight time frame, you don't want to have to start again, go back to zero and start again. So what he's saying is sometimes when you submit license applications and you do it too quickly, you don't give them all the information, you have to start again. So his question is, does the same thing happen with commodity jurisdiction determinations? Unfortunately, if you don't submit enough information, they may send it back to you, RWA. But there's also a very great risk that they'll just reach the conclusion that it's on the munitions list. So in other words, if when you're submitting a commodity jurisdiction request, and if you do it quickly and sloppily and you don't do a good job, there's more to risk than it just being sent back and you lose a month of time. If it's not done with a lot of thought and effort, you risk getting the wrong outcome. Then your product is, then they've determined it's on the U.S. munitions list. And if there was good evidence that it shouldn't be on the list, and you didn't get that information to them, you may be stuck with a product on the munitions list that shouldn't be there. So the short answer is you need to provide as much care in a CJ as you do for an export license. We have several DOD contracts that require us to occasionally go CONUS to U.S. bases where we perform services at a military base. during these trips, we do not interact with foreign personnel. We only act with U.S. DOD personnel or other DOD contractors. Are there any ITAR compliance issues related to this? So based on this very limited email that you're sending, there's nothing in that email that sounds like it's there's nothing in this email that suggests that you need to get any licenses or TAAs. There are some ITAR compliance issues related to this. If you're performing a service for U.S. military in the U.S., even if you're not exporting anything, number one, you need to determine if you have to register or not. Number two, the materials that you're preparing and giving to the DOD probably are ITAR-controlled. So they're ITAR-controlled technical data. So you need to make sure that you apply your controls even in the U.S. So you have the proper data security requirements in place. You don't disclose that to any foreign national employees. You don't permit any other foreign nationals to have access to the equipment or to the premises or to the data, etc. So there could be ITAR requirements that apply. The ITAR record keeping will apply. So the answer is yes, there are some requirements that apply that you should be thinking about in this process. What if we are an American company that is contracted by the U.S. government to transport items on the munitions list from one foreign country to another? Do we require a license under such circumstances? That's actually a highly technical question. Usually if a party is an exporter, they get the export license. On the license, they'll specify who the recipient is, who the freight forwarder is, etc., and the transaction will be licensed that way. One thing I will caution you, however, is if you're performing any other logistical services, often companies that perform transportation services perform additional services such as warehouse services, handling services, packing things for export shipment, unpacking, inventory control, servicing repairs. So logistics contracts can be very broad. What I would say on your question, it's difficult for me to say unilaterally that there's no controls. Usually the exporter will get the license, but there could be certain instances in which case the transportation company is required to get the license in something called routed transactions, etc. So I would look carefully at that. There could be instances where that's controlled. Why does state and not the Defense Department control ITAR? Can you recommend any specific training, webinar, workshops that explain how to find CCL ITAR items? So State Department promulgates the regulations, and they deal with the export licensing applications, but the Department of Defense is also very heavily involved. So this is effectively regulation by both the DOD and the State Department. When you submit an export license application or a commodity jurisdiction request, or almost even a voluntary disclosure, in most cases the State Department sends it out what they call interagency. And that means they send it to the Department of Defense and often to other agencies as well, such as Commerce, Homeland Security, etc. But the Defense Technology Security Administration reviews each license application, and they're making substantive calls on whether these items can be licensed or not. Usually, DOD makes the decision on the technology. is this the technology that we want someone in the United Kingdom or the UAE or Bahrain to have? The State Department deals more with diplomatic issues. Do we want, on a diplomatic basis, do we want U.S. companies to be dealing with these particular countries? But the answer is all of the agencies put their recommendations in, and the response that comes back to you incorporates all of the comments of all of these agencies. Regarding software and technical data, I understand how designs and data are relevant to manufacturing, usage, etc., are under ITAR. What administrative documentation, e.g. project reports, timesheets, perhaps describing the development of such software designs, would also be under ITAR? Well, the answer is you need to look at the definition of technical data in the ITAR. It's at 22 CFR 120.10, and it's quite broad. In fact, let me look at it real quick. I can read it to you, but it basically covers. All right. Technical data means information which is required for the design, development, production, manufacture, assembly, operation, repair, testing, maintenance, or modification of defense articles. This includes information in the form of blueprints, drawings, photographs, plans, instructions, documentations. That's only part of the definition. We don't have time to go through the whole thing. But number one, the point is this is quite broad. So you need to be, what I would recommend is go to section 120.10, read the full definition, and then you'll get a sense of what items it controls. Okay. There's a few more. I'm going to keep going if folks are interested. All right. We have products that were developed or modified on FFP COTS procurement contracts with the DOD and assume they are therefore USML listed? Question mark. Is DOD 4076 the mechanism to confirm or get them removed? So the standard is for if something is ITAR controlled, you look at the munitions list. If it's on the munitions list, it's controlled under ITAR. If you're not sure if it's controlled or not, then you are permitted to submit a commodity jurisdiction request to the State Department. And there's information you're required to submit. They will review it. They'll send it out through that interagency process that I said to DTSA and other agencies. And they'll come back and they'll actually send you a response in writing, and they'll confirm for you if it's on the munitions list or not. And that's normally the way we recommend going through these things. When they send you the commodity jurisdiction determination, often they will also tell you if the item is listed on the Commerce Control List or not. Unfortunately, they don't do that all the time. But in recent cases, they've been saying that frequently. They'll say, it is on the U.S., it is on the Commerce Control List, or it's not, or if it's not, if it's EAR 99. Okay. During some of these trips, we are asked to carry spare parts, hard drives that are solely for the use of U.S. personnel at a U.S. base. Are there ITAR compliance issues here? Do these products require an export license? So the answer is there may be. So if you're bringing spare parts, you mentioned hard drives, so I'm presuming these are computer components. The first thing you need to do is figure out the classification of these parts. Are these parts in computers? Are they parts of aircraft? Are they parts of firearms, and you need to figure out if it's on the munitions list or not, if it's on the commerce control list or not. Without that, we really can't answer the question. So once you've done that, if it's on one of those lists, if it's on the U.S. munitions list, then you look to see if there's a license exemption that may be available. Under ITAR, to some extent, and under the EAR, there are some exceptions if for spare parts, and in some cases for tools. This is more under the Export Administration regulations than under ITAR. But there could be some license exceptions under one or the other that would permit you to bring those items with you without a license. So the key is, number one, do the classifications, and then number two, see if any license exceptions are available. Does it cost any money to register your products with USML? How is the application process? How long does it take? If you register your company under the registration provisions, there is a fee that you pay to the State Department of $2,250 for the first time registration. And then there's an annual renewal fee. There's no other fees that are payable to state for normal licensing or other types of activities. If you have a high volume of licenses, they'll calculate that, and in the following year, they may adjust the registration fee for the company. And let's see. If a service we are providing for a foreign country involves defense products and tech orders that they own, and we are not training any foreign nationals, do we consider a TAA, or do we need to consider a TAA or a license? All right, so this is a great question. So you're performing a service, operations or maintenance, for a foreign country involving defense products. If you're performing a service for a foreign party related to an item on the munitions list, that service is most likely a defense service and requires a TAA. There may be some license exceptions, but as a general rule, performing those services will require a technical assistance agreement. Now, the person asking the question says, these are operations and maintenance services. The foreign party owns the products for the repair, the spare parts. Does that matter? Well, you're not exporting the parts, so you don't need to worry about an export license for the parts. But you do need to consider the license for the services, and if it's for a foreign party, then that's a defense service. You would need a TAA for that. Okay, I work for a company that does not export a commodity, but more so training. We have LOAs with the U.S. Air Force and are more a sub with the USAF. We deal with FMS and non-FMS contracts. Are we only, I can't read this word, employed for FMS and need TAAs for non-FMS, or do we need TAAs for all? Okay, so I think what the person is saying is they perform training services. Some are FMS, foreign military sales, and some are not foreign military sales. Do we need to worry about ITAR? Well, a couple of levels of answers here. Number one, if you're performing services, including certain services for training for U.S. munitions list items, that may be a defense service. There could be exemptions, or it may not apply for certain low-level training, but you need to check that carefully. In most cases, if you're performing services, certainly military-type services, that's probably a defense service which will need a TAA. Now, if your contract is under a foreign military sales program, there is an exemption under ITAR for FMS. If you fit within that exemption, you can perform the contract without ITAR requirements. However, the FMS exemption has a long list of conditions and terms. And sometimes the FMS contract fits within those conditions, and sometimes it does not. So what you need to do is, for your FMS contract, you need to look through the FMS exemption and see if you meet the conditions under that exemption. It has to deal with the letter of offer and acceptance, what they call the LOA, and if you have a written LOA in the contract, etc. If your contract is not an FMS, then then you have to look if it's going to be subject to ITAR. If it's not FMS, that FMS exemption will not apply, and then it's quite possible that you will need to obtain a TAA for that, unless we can find some license exception that would apply. Referring to my preceding question, does it make a difference if we're transporting the items from one military base in a foreign jurisdiction to another military base in another military jurisdiction, in another foreign jurisdiction? That's actually a good question. I think that's what's called a re-export transaction. I think if your company is transporting the products, it probably needs an export license originally to export it from the U.S., and if you're moving it from one military base to another, probably need a separate authorization from the State Department called re-export authorization to ship it from one foreign location to another. If you're going from one foreign country to another, it's called a re-export. If you're going from one location in a foreign country to a different location in the same foreign country, that's called a retransfer. Usually you require authorization for re-exports or retransfers. There may be a license exception that applies, and so that's the other thing I would suggest. We may need to look for to see if an exemption would apply. If an item is exempt under the Wassenaar Agreement and has an ECCN number, that is an EAR license required, if we are importing it to perform a product qualification, would it fall under temporary import exception? Basically, ITAR has requirements for imports, for temporary imports. You mentioned Wassenaar and an EIR license. The EIR does not have requirements for imports. So if you're referring to a temporary license here, I'm presuming that you're referring to something imported that's ITAR-controlled. As I mentioned, if the item is ITAR-controlled, there are exemptions for temporary imports for ITAR-controlled items under 123.4, but those only apply if it's a U.S. origin item. It wouldn't apply if it's a foreign manufactured item. Here's another question. Are bill of materials considered technical data? Is a bill of materials, it's possible. Certainly, if the bill of materials is for non-defense items, or if it's for purely non-defense components, and it just says 15 washers and 17 screws and 13 grommets. There are good arguments to say that that's not ITAR controlled. On the other hand, if the bill of materials identifies the components that go into a defense article, that list of components could actually describe the defense article or teach someone how to construct it. And so in that case, a bill of materials could very well be ITAR controlled. So I would say I would need to know more about the bill of materials. In some cases it may not. It's very, very possible that it could be, depending on what's in it. If a prime contractor has gone through FMS and sold a product to a foreign country, including operations and maintenance, and we are a subcontractor performing the O&M, are we safe under FMS as well? So, as I mentioned, there's a license exemption under ITAR for FMS. The exemption has a long list of conditions. What you would need to do is go through those conditions and confirm if you would fit within those. One of the conditions is that the contract is performed under a letter of LOA, letter of offer and acceptance, which is the document used in FMS contracts. As a subcontractor, you may not have access to the LOA, and you may not know if the LOA applies to what you're doing. So what I would have to look more carefully at that. I think it's possible. My recommendation is you will need to go look through the conditions under FMS to see if you fit within the exemption or not, in the FMS exemption or not. If you're not sure, that's the type of thing the State Department could advise you on under a commodity jurisdiction or an advisory opinion request. Okay. Do end use also apply to ITAR items, just like EAR? So the answer is yes. If you're applying for an export license for an ITAR item, the State Department will ask you to submit, you'll be required in the license application to submit all of the facts of the transaction, including who the end user is, the end use, and the country of ultimate destination. If a new company wants to pursue a U.S. DOD contract, is the first step to register with ITAR and the Commerce Department. If you want to perform a DOD contract, there's certain registrations that are required with the Department of Defense, which are separate from ITAR. And so that has nothing to do. You get your DUNS number. There are a number of very basic steps just to get registered to submit proposals to the DOD. The ITAR requirements are completely separate from that. The ITAR requirements, the time to register is as set out in the registration section in ITAR, and which is part 122. It's 122.1, and it's the first time that you either manufacture or export or temporarily import an item on the munitions list or perform a defense service or do the brokering. The first time you do any of those, then you're required to register under ITAR. Okay, I think we're almost at the end. Does your firm offer services to pre-review the DS-4076 submissions to make sure it is our best case? That's the commodity jurisdiction. The answer is yes. We do that a lot. We do that a lot of times with companies. Either we prepare the commodity jurisdiction request, or they prepare it and we review it. It's and the answer is yes, we do that a lot, and it's yeah. All right. If we are shipping U.S. military equipment from one overseas U.S. base to another, but we are using TMO, U.S. government transportation, do we need to involve the State Department? I hate to have a wishy-washy answer, but I need to know more about the details of the shipment. If the U.S. government is doing the transportation, then the U.S. company is not the exporter in most cases and would not need to worry about the license. But that applies if the U.S. government is doing pretty much everything involved in the transportation, getting it ready, putting it on the carrier, paying the carrier, or maybe the U.S. government is the carrier. Frequently the government hires U.S. companies to do some of that or to do all of it. And if the government hires you to do the transportation, it is possible that then you may become the exporter and you may have ITAR requirements. So to answer that properly, we really would need more facts about precisely who's doing what in the transportation function. It's possible that even if the U.S. government is playing some role in the transportation, there could be some requirements on the U.S. company as well, depending on the facts. Okay, it looks like that's the end of our questions. So we're coming to the end of our program. And it's been a pleasure working with everyone here. As I mentioned, if anyone has any follow-up questions, shoot me an email. We'll be sending out the slides shortly, and that'll have the email addresses, etc. on that. And I thank everyone for participating in our program. Take care.